Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week in ICD-10 CM coding. This week we have chapters 16 and 17 covering the diseases of the musculoskeletal system and the reproductive urinary system. Let's take a look at chapter 16 first. Chapter 16 covers diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue. All these codes begin with M as in muscle, M00 through M99. I'm going to give you a quick overview on what to focus on for the diagnosis coding, along with some hints that will make more sense when you get into reading the material and watching the video lectures. First of all, very, very important, pay very close attention to the exact anatomic site and the laterality. Most of the codes in this chapter require you to know the exact anatomical site and whether it's right, left, or bilateral. Secondly, for fractures, don't forget all the seventh characters. These include A for initial encounter, D for subsequent with routine healing, G for delayed healing, K for non-union, P for malunion, and S for sequela. A common mistake that we see students do is forgetting the seventh character entirely. Please remember, if your code does not have 6 characters before the 7th character, you need to add a placeholder X before the 7th character of A, D, G, K, P, or S. Another helpful hint is to differentiate between acute and chronic and recurrent. The duration matters, and this will help you select the correct code. Finally, osteoporosis coding requires very careful attention to detail. For instance, code category M80, osteoporosis with current pathological fracture, versus M81, osteoporosis without current fracture. And again, the codes may have the 7th character, which you've already covered. We also need to look at pathologic versus traumatic fractures. Pathologic fractures occurs because the bone is weak versus a traumatic fracture. Then finally, we have connective tissue disorders involving these that are systemic, and these include such things as systemic lupus erythematosus, Sjögren's syndrome, polymyositis, and these require careful reading so you can get the systemic involvement and get the correct code. Next, we have Chapter 17, the genitourinary system. These have a code range of N00 through N99. This is another chapter that has a lot of instructional notes that are found in the tabular. There are a lot of code also, use additional codes, and so on. An example of this is glomerular disease. There's a direction to code also associated kidney failure. Cystitis codes will ask you to code for the infectious agent from B95 through B97. And then chronic kidney disease, we need to code first the underlying conditions such as diabetes or hypertension. Another key point is CKD staging has to come from the provider documentation. It does not come from the GFR values that you get in the lab. That may support the physician's decision, but we don't code off the GFR lab results. Also need to look for acute kidney failure versus chronic kidney disease. And then again, our old friend excludes 1 versus excludes 2. These are very, very important. Excludes 1, of course, means it's mutually exclusive. The 2 conditions can't be coded together. Excludes 2, on the other hand, means that they can be coded together if the documentation supports this. I hope this is helpful to you to give you a little idea of what we're going to be covering. again, I've noticed that a lot of people are starting to get more familiar with it. The mistakes that we've seen in the past, we're seeing fewer of them, but it's worth reminding to always code to the highest level of specificity. That means laterality, that means severity, stage, all those things that are covered in the tabular. Follow all the instructional notes in the tabular. They're there to guide you. You don't have to remember all these things for all 70,000 codes. It's right there in the tabular to help you. And then read the documentation slowly and carefully. The musculoskeletal system and the GU chapters are very detail heavy, and these details are what determines the correct code. And then, of course, said it before, say it again. I probably will say it throughout the course. Always validate in the tabular. I hope you found all this useful. Thank you for being in the class. Enjoy the Super Bowl and have a great week. Bye now.